Hi guys, so today we are going to cover chapter 20, which for my majors it is actually chapter 46, talking about ecosystems and the biosphere. So what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is basically a community that includes the non-living components. So it's both the abiotic and biotic. So it's on a larger scale. It's characterized by how the chemicals flow through the ecosystem and how energy flows through the ecosystem. So the abiotic components are the non-living things. This is like soil, water, temperature, wind, rocks, sunlight. And then the biotic components are the living things. And those are divided into two major groups, the producers and the consumers. The producers are the autotrophs. Now, we've talked about autotrophs a lot, so remember those are organisms that make their own food. So photosynthesizers, for example, that use sunlight to make their own food. But there's also chemosynthesizers that use chemicals to make their own food. So the examples are plants, cyanobacteria, and algae. Consumers, on the other hand, are heterotrophs. These are organisms that cannot make their own food. And those are categorized further. Herbivores are plant eaters. Carnivores are meat eaters. Omnivores eat both plants and meat. And then decomposers and detritivores feed on dead material. So energy flow is going to rely on the producers and how they can absorb the solar energy and turn it around into food for the consumers. So it starts with the sun. The sun is basically the ultimate source of all energy on the planet. And then the producers or the autotrophs are going to use the sun to make food. And then the consumers or the heterotrophs are then going to eat the producers or other consumers that ate producers. So the bottom line is the sun starts it all. Without the sun, we have nothing. So the laws of thermodynamics that we are concerned with are the first two. The first law of thermodynamics says that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It can only be transformed. So what that's saying is all of the energy in the universe is constant. We're not actually creating energy and we're not destroying energy. What we are doing is transforming it from one form of energy to another. So we can transform chemical energy into mechanical energy, for example. And then the second law of thermodynamics talks about energy transformations. We know that we can only transform energy, but unfortunately, all of those energy transformations result in some of the energy being lost as heat. Heat cannot be used in order to do cellular work. So basically, all of the energy that's lost as heat is lost to the universe. So a concept that's important is that ecosystems have to have a constant input of energy because most of the energy is transformed into heat, which then dissipates into the environment. So basically, all of the energy that we are transforming most of it is lost to the environment as heat. So ecosystems have to have a constant input of energy in order to keep going because they need to be replenished for what they're lost as heat, basically. So we have a constant input of energy going into the planet from the sun, of course. Energy is going to flow and nutrients are going to cycle through the ecosystem. So nutrients are going to cycle and energy is going to flow through the ecosystem. So we have what are called abiotic reservoirs. These are non-living areas where all of these nutrients are kept. Geologic processes are what help fill those abiotic reservoirs. So weathering of rocks, for example, is going to help fill the phosphorus reservoir. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the nutrients are going to enter the food chain and they're going to be made available to producers. The producers are going to use those nutrients to make food. And then consumers are then going to eat those producers or other consumers that have already eaten producers. Decomposers connect it all because they break down everything that dies. So producers, even those that don't get eaten, die at some point. Consumers, even those that don't get eaten, die at some point. So decomposers' role is to come in and break down all of that organic material and recycle any nutrients that are left over. The decomposers are going to recycle them and then add them to that abiotic reservoir. So the abiotic reservoir has two things adding to it: geological processes and decomposers. So decomposition is basically what connects all of the trophic levels together. That picture over there is a picture of shelf fungi, which are decomposers, breaking down that tree. Now keep in mind, it's going to take a while for them to break down that tree. It doesn't happen overnight. Chemical cycling relies on the producer's ability to acquire inorganic nutrients, which, remember the inorganic nutrients that we talked about, CHNOPS: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Now those come from the physical environment, and the producers are going to convert them into organic nutrients, or what we would know as food. So autotrophs are going to supply the food for heterotrophs, and decomposers break down the organics into the inorganics, and then make the inorganics available to the autotrophs again. So another important concept is that ecosystems have to have efficient chemical cycling in order to sustain the biosystem. Food webs illustrate the feeding relationships between organisms. So basically, it's who feeds on who. It represents how the energy and nutrients flow through the ecosystem. Now, food webs are pretty complicated. As the name implies, it's a web. So organisms can be eaten and they can eat. So it's all intertwined. So food webs are really important if you're going to go into ecology in the field itself. Otherwise, food chains are very simplified ways to look at it. They usually only have 3 to 4 links, and as the name implies, it's a chain. So, for example, a producer is going to be eaten by a primary consumer, which will then be eaten by a secondary consumer, which will then be eaten by a tertiary consumer. An example would be you have an oak tree. Caterpillars are feeding on the oak tree. A bird is going to eat the caterpillar, and then a hawk is going to come in and eat the bird. Food webs, unlike food chains, can overlap. So here's an example of a food web. So as you can see, you have multiple levels. They're all intertwined, and organisms can be eaten and eat. So ecological pyramids are diagrams that are used to describe various things about the ecosystem. They can describe number, biomass, energy flow at different trophic levels. Trophic levels are composed of organisms that occupy the same position within a food web or a food chain. So for example, the producers are a trophic level, primary consumers are a trophic level, secondary consumers are a trophic level, and you get the basic gist. Here's an example of an ecological pyramid. Remember, as you go up in levels, you're losing energy between levels because energy is being transformed. So you lose that energy as heat. So as you get up to the top, you can actually support fewer animals at each level because you need more and more food to support them. So at the bottom, we have sunlight. The primary producers will get about 10,000 joules of that sunlight. But then the primary consumers who eat those producers only get about 1,000 joules, so they get about 10%. Secondary consumers get about 10% of that, and tertiary consumers get about 10% of that. So by the time you get up to a tertiary consumer, you're only getting 10 joules of energy out of all of that sunlight. So tertiary consumers have to consume more and more food to get the same amount of energy as secondary consumers do. Secondary consumers have to consume more food to get the same amount of energy as primary consumers. So the general rule is only 10% of energy or biomass is going to be transferred to the next trophic level. Each trophic level is going to be smaller than the preceding one. Why? Well, because some energy is going to be consumed for maintenance, not reproduction. They still have to sustain themselves, even when they're not reproducing. So some of that energy is going to be consumed for that. And then you have waste and excretion. Some is going to be lost in waste products and as we excrete. There are problems in using pyramids to describe the ecological relationships, though. One problem is, where do you put detritivores and decomposers? Those aren't really at the bottom of the pyramid, but where do they go? They recycle nutrients and break down all of the other things on the pyramid. So there really isn't a place for them. Also, omnivores. Omnivores eat plants and animals, so they're not necessarily primary consumers because they eat animals too. And then some pyramids are actually inverted, like biomass pyramids. Basically, a pyramid is going to oversimplify energy flow. So, biogeochemical cycles involve the cycling of chemicals between the abiotic and the biotic community. Now, this is something you need to know for your test, so remember it. It all starts with the reservoir. From the reservoir, it goes through the exchange pool to the biotic community. Now, remember, the biotic community is the living community. So you've got your producers, your consumers, and your decomposers. The decomposers break down and recycle nutrients, so they'll go back through the exchange pool to the reservoir. And human activities, of course, are going to impact all of this. And this is also on your portfolio. There are 4 pretty important cycles: the hydrologic or water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. Biogeochemical cycles help get rid of waste. Human activities, of course, are going to disrupt biogeochemical cycles. If we release excess pollutants, for example, that's going to disrupt these cycles. And the effect of all of this is it's going to threaten the quality of the health and the biodiversity within the ecosystem. Because if some organisms need nutrients that are no longer available, they're going to die. If they need nutrients that are in excess supply, they're going to grow in excess, and that's going to throw off other organisms. So here's the water cycle. You have transpiration, which hopefully you remember from last semester or earlier this semester. Transpiration is when the water evaporates from the plant leaves. You have water vapor, which is going to rain down as precipitation. Evaporation from the oceans and lakes, and runoff, of course. And then the groundwater on the bottom, underground aquifers, which supply the water in the first place. The important stuff that you need to know is that the abiotic reservoir is a surface and atmospheric water. They enter the food chain through precipitation, and when the plants use the water to do their thing, they're recycled through transpiration, and they return to the abiotic through evaporation and runoff. So make sure you know that stuff. Here's the carbon cycle. Now there's a lot of things going on here, but you can see the combustion of fuels at the top, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Respiration is going to give off carbon dioxide. Photosynthesis is going to use carbon dioxide, and then it's going to also diffuse in and out of the water. The important things you need to know for this is the abiotic reservoirs, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They enter the food chain through photosynthesis, specifically carbon fixation in the Calvin cycle, and they return to the abiotic through respiration. The nitrogen cycle gets more complicated. If you ever have to take an environmental microbiology class, you'll learn all about this. You have a lot of different bacteria involved here, but the biggest things you guys need to know are that the abiotic reservoir is the nitrogen in the atmosphere. It enters the food chain through nitrogen fixation by the soil and aquatic bacteria. It's recycled by decomposing and nitrifying bacteria, and is returned to the abiotic by denitrifying bacteria. The phosphorus cycle is relatively simplistic compared to the other ones. The abiotic reservoir are the rocks, minerals, and soil. They enter the food chain by uptake in plants and erosion that releases a soluble phosphate. So basically the rocks weather and release the phosphate into the water. They're recycled by decomposing bacteria and fungi, and they're returned to the abiotic through loss in the ocean sediment. Here's a chart to help you try to keep everything straight between natural ecosystems versus human ecosystems. Natural ecosystems, we're talking about those in nature. Human ecosystems, of course, we're talking about the ones that involve humans. Natural ecosystems are complex food webs, while human ecosystems are relatively short food chains. Natural ecosystems have a constant population size, whereas human ecosystems are increasing. Natural ecosystems, energy is used for maintenance. Human ecosystems, energy is used for growth. Recycling in natural ecosystems is very efficient. Recycling in human ecosystems is very poor. And natural ecosystems do not depend on outside resources like human ecosystems do. Now make sure you know this chart because you're going to have a matching question on your test where you need to know this. A biome is a relatively large, distinct terrestrial region with certain characteristics. So it's going to have a certain climate, soil, plants, animals, and landscapes. Terrestrial biomes are identified using precipitation and temperature. So here you can see the biggest ones. The tundra would be the coldest with the lowest precipitation. The tropical rainforest would be the warmest with the highest precipitation. And then on the other end, you have desert being the warmest with the lowest precipitation, and everything in between. You should be familiar with this from your activity. A tropical rainforest has mineral poor soil, high rainfall that's evenly distributed throughout the year. A tropical rainforest has mineral poor soil. It has high rainfall evenly distributed throughout the year. There's high species richness, which means that there's a lot of different types of species, and high productivity. The average temperature is between 20 and 34 degrees Celsius. In the savanna, it's tropical grassland. There's widely scattered trees interspersed with grassy areas. It occurs in tropical areas that have low or seasonal rainfall. So the temperatures are going to be warmer, but not as much rainfall. You're going to see giraffes, elephants, lions, hyenas, acacia trees, elephant grass, Bermuda grass in these areas. A desert, you have cold deserts and you have warm deserts. Cold deserts are in the temperate climates and warm deserts are in subtropical or tropical regions. There's very low precipitation regardless on the temperature. Organisms are specialized with water-conserving adaptations, so things like spines on the cactus. You're going to see bobcats, Gila monsters, yuccas, roadrunners, things like that. The chaparral has thickets of small evergreens. The climate is very wet. It has mild winters and dry summers. Temperate grasslands have deep mineral-rich soil. There's enough precipitation, but it's pretty uncertain on when it's going to come, so it's well suited to growing grain crops. The temperate forest has relatively high precipitation. The soils are rich in organic matter. The trees have very broad leaves and they're deciduous. The average temperature is around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. There's 4 distinct seasons, so spring, summer, winter, and fall. You're going to see oaks, maples, eagle deer, black bear, things like that. Boreal forests are coniferous trees that dominate the taiga. Cold winters, short growing seasons, very acidic mineral poor soil. Plants are going to include evergreens, so spruce, spruce, pines, and then deciduous larch and tamarack. Animals are going to have fur-bearing predators like the lynx, weasels, and then snowshoe hares, red squirrels, lemmings. We talked about the lynx and the snowshoe hare and their cycle with predator and prey. Maybe you remember that. The Arctic tundra is the northernmost biome. There's actually a layer of permafrost that characterizes this area, which is a frozen layer of subsoil. There's low-growing vegetation, which is adapted to extreme cold and a short growing season. You're going to have mosses, lichens, grasses, and there actually are flowers there. Caribou, muskox, Arctic hare, lemmings, a few carnivores like snow owls, polar bears, things like that. This is just showing you how the biomes are spread out around the world. Aquatically speaking, we do have ecosystems. Some important environmental factors here are salinity, which is the amount of salt, the amount of dissolved oxygen, and how much light is available for photosynthesis. Marine environments, you have the intertidal zone, which is the shoreline between low and high tides. Organisms can be exposed to air at low tide and underwater at high tide. So organisms have to be adapted to here. So brown algae is one of those organisms that's adapted. Neritic province are open ocean from the shoreline out to 200 meters. These have the highest productivity and biodiversity in the ocean. There's a relatively stable temperature, a high oxygen content, not a lot of pressure, and they can perform photosynthesis. The oceanic province is out deeper than 200 meters. It's less productive because the nutrients get pretty scarce out here. And then the abyssal zone is 400 meters or greater. There's very cold temperatures, high oxygen but low nutrients, and very high pressure here. Light cannot penetrate that deep, so photosynthesis cannot occur. So they have to use chemicals at the hydrothermal vents in order to produce food. Ocean ridges formed by marine invertebrates that live in the warm, shallow waters are called coral reefs. When the waters are nutritionally poor, the organisms rely on mutualistic relationships. So like the sea anemone, for example, and the clownfish. Coral reefs are one of the most diverse biomes that we have, but they're also one of the ones in most danger. Human interference is what is starting to kill the coral reefs, because when you touch the coral reef, that part starts to bleach and the plants lose all of their ability to photosynthesize, and the coral reef essentially dies. Estuaries are coastal bodies of water with access to both the ocean and fresh water from rivers. So estuaries are unique because they have access to salt water and fresh water. This is the transition from land to sea, basically. They're often called bays, lagoons, or inlets. You're going to have a lot of shorebirds, fish, crabs, lobsters, clams and shellfish, seabirds in this area. Freshwater ecosystems include flowing water ecosystems like streams and rivers. The point of origin is called the source water. It is cold, low nutrients, and it's clear, very fast moving. As it flows away from the source, the width starts to widen and the current starts to slow down and the temperature is able to increase. Standing water ecosystems like ponds and lakes, these are influenced by the terrestrial biome that surrounds it. So the surroundings are going to determine what ecosystem that pond or lake has. And then we have freshwater wetlands. These are environments which the soil is either permanently or periodically saturated with water. Marshes, swamps, and bogs. Wetlands are very important because they kind of act as buffers. So they're protective in nature. And they also protect areas from flooding. So wetlands are very crucial to survival as well. Okay, so that is this chapter. We will talk soon. Bye.